Good morning. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We are so excited that you joined us today. You came back after the last couple weeks here at Sycamore Creek Church, so that's a good sign. You guys showed up after that series. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm so excited to be with you. If I haven't met you before, my name is Mitch Frost. I'm the student pastor here at Sycamore Creek Church, and I'm particularly excited about this series. My second book called Something is Missing comes out June 10th, and I am so excited. Thank you. I'm so excited because I get 3 weeks to spend with all of you. You guys are stuck with me for 3 weeks. This is so fun. I've said it before, but high school students don't intimidate me at all. You guys intimidate me. So the thought of doing this for 3 weeks is a little bit scary. But I'm very, very excited. But here's the deal. I want to say this right off the beginning as we dive in here this morning. Some of you might already be thinking this, so let me just clarify for you. Some of you are like, do I really have to listen to this guy preach for 3 weeks on why I should buy his book, and then maybe I'm so kind that I go and buy his book, and then I read the same things that he just preached to me for 3 weeks. Here's the deal. Nothing that I am preaching for the next 3 weeks is in the book. All of the sermons that I've written for this series for 3 weeks, none of those messages, none of that content is in the book at all. Actually, that's kind of not my heart. My mission is not that. I want you to be able to come for the next 3 weeks and be a part of this series and hopefully understand and see God better and not just be sold on a book that I happen to write. So just know that going forward, that this is not just like a 3-week-long commercial of why you should buy my book, okay? If you do, hey, thank you so much. That's so generous of you, but that's not the goal of this series. The goal of this series is hopefully to get you to understand that something is missing inside each and every one of us. What we're going to do for 3 weeks is we're going to look at, we're kind of going to put on display 3 different Bible characters and look at what was missing in their lives and maybe draw some connections between how they lived and how we live. And the book is going to, I'll be honest, the book is going to give you the answers to these things that are missing in your life. But my goal for the next 3 weeks is hopefully to get you to identify what might be missing in your life and maybe what we can do about it. So today, what we're going to do, we're going to dive into week number 1, character number 1. We're going to talk about Peter this morning. I love the story of Peter. Peter is one of the most vulnerable, raw, and real stories that I think we have in the Bible. And not only that, but he is one of the most obvious stories of redemption. His story is so beautiful of how it starts and how it ends is so different. And so today, let me just be honest about this too. This is a lot of story. All right, so sit back. We're going to try to, in 30 minutes, dive into all of Peter's story. It's going to be quick. It's going to be a lot. But I'm going to have to skip over some things. All right, so don't be mad at me if I skip your favorite story or your favorite detail about Peter's life. All right. But we're going to do our best to get through Peter's story here in the time that I have with you this morning. So let's just dive in. John 5, starting at verse 1. Most of the verses are going to be on the screen, but not all of them, because I didn't want the person running slides to hate me with how many verses there was going to be. But most of them are going to be up there. So one day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of, go ahead and pronounce that however you want, because I'm not going to try, the people were crowding around him, listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen, who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." Now, when I read Simon Peter, when I read his voice, I love to picture him with a ton of attitude, just a ton of just kind of rude, right? So you'll hear that come out as I tell this story. But so kind of how I read that is like, all right, know-it-all, we've been out here all night doing what we're paid to do, but since you say to do it again, we'll do it again. Watch this. And then they throw the nets into the water, all right? When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. What we're going to do, because this is a lot of story here this morning, is we're going to kind of split up Peter's story into different chunks or chapters, if you will. We're going to give him a different title that describes that maybe chapter of his life. So for the first one, we have Peter the fisher of men. This guy named Peter who was a fisherman by trade, right, which probably means that his parents were fishermen as well. Okay, so he was raised in the trade. This is what he did for a living. And he goes from that job to becoming a fisher of men. He kind of comes face to face with this guy named Jesus, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to go all in. I'm sold out. I really like what this guy is talking about, so I am into this, right? And from there, his story kind of takes off. It's kind of like a rocket ship. Peter just goes all in, and I love the way that this verse puts it. They dropped everything and followed him. What a response, right? They meet this guy, they see that he clearly performed a miracle right in front of them, and instead of like, well, let's, ask some questions and make sure that we agree with everything this guy's, talking about, they just go all in. They leave everything, they drop everything, and they follow him. I think it's so cool. And then a couple chapters later, we have the first list of Jesus' disciples, the first list of his followers that he sends out into the world, and on that list is this guy named Peter. Right? This story is so unexpected in the beginning because this guy who was a fisherman, which was a pretty lowly trade at the time, right? He was unexpected. He wasn't qualified. And now he's on this list of 12 disciples that Jesus was going to use to reach the world. It's pretty cool. A lot of people, when they were expecting the Messiah, they were expecting the Son of God to come and change the world. And when they started, were probably thinking about who's he going to use and who's he going to call to follow him. They were probably like, oh, he's probably going to come for the D1 draft pick that Jesus would love to have on his team, right? He's probably going to come for the most well-known and the most popular people. But then Jesus shows up and he goes for these lowly fishermen. This guy named Peter who didn't deserve it. I just think it's awesome. In Matthew 14, I know I'm skipping so much here, but stick with me. Matthew 14, we have the story of Peter walking on water. You know this one? We love this one in Sunday school, right? It's so cool. The disciples are in the boat, and there's a storm so bad that it's scaring these disciples that most of them were fishermen, which means they shouldn't have been scared of a storm, but that shows you how bad it was, right? And they're in this boat, and they're kind of freaking out, and they look through the waves, and Jesus is just casually taking a stroll on the water. He's like, what's up, guys? And Peter calls out to him, and he's like, Lord, if that's really you, tell me to walk on the water. And Jesus is like, let's go, bro, right now. Come on. And so Peter steps over the boat and begins to walk on the water, right? And his eyes are kind of locked on Jesus, and he's actually taking steps in the storm. And then he looks down, and he gets overwhelmed, and he starts to sink, right? We love that story. 2 chapters later, Matthew 16, before any of the other disciples declare that Jesus is Lord of their life, Peter is the first one to speak up. Check this out. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea and Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say it's John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Which, by the way, is one of the most important questions you can ask yourself in this journey of following God. Who do you say that Jesus is? Because all day long, you can look up answers and you can hear answers from your parents or grandparents or maybe just the way that you're raised, but who do you say that Jesus is? So Jesus has this moment with his disciples where he makes it really personal, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered before anybody else, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. AKA, I believe in who you are. Right? This Peter guy is unreal. I mean, unreal. He goes all in and dives in, and now not only is he walking on water, but he's declaring that Jesus is the Lord of his life. Right? But he's also known for being the one to put his foot in his mouth. He's also known for being one of the most blunt disciples of them all. He's also known for being the one that, as we're going to get to in a moment, denies Jesus 3 times. So this guy, Peter, has all of these things in his story. High highs and low lows. But the first thing that Peter's story tells us is this. God doesn't require perfection to be used by him. This may sound so simple to you. Maybe you've been coming to church for a long time and you're like, yeah, got it. But I think it could serve as a good reminder this morning. The God of the Bible does not require perfection to be used by him. Isn't that pretty cool? Because God is perfect. God has never made a mistake. God has never been anything other than God. He's good, he's kind, he's loving, he's just, he's all those things, and he is perfect, complete, needs nothing. But he doesn't require that to be used by him. It's pretty cool. And Peter's story is such a big example of this because he was so far from perfect. And some of us in the room, I hate to tell you this morning, but we are sitting around waiting till we're good enough, and then we'll start speaking up about our faith. Then we'll be used by God, then we'll go all in, then we'll kind of answer that nudge we've had in our head for a long time of what we should do with our money or what we should do with our time. Maybe someday we'll get there. Someday we'll be, maybe fluent enough in the way we speak. Someday maybe we'll have enough verses stored up in our heart and our mind. Someday maybe we'll have enough money. We'll wait. We'll get there. We'll wait till we get enough of something, and then we'll go all in. But God does not require perfection to be used by him. God requires a yes. What you're going to find about this God throughout the entire Bible is that God's just asking for obedience. God's saying, hey, guess what? The standard of perfection has already been met through my son Jesus, so all I'm asking is a yes. All I'm asking is for you just to trust me. What happens with us in the room is if we're so boggled down and weighed down by, I just got to be good enough, I got to get past a certain point, what happens is you actually end up doing nothing with your life. What happens is when you're so obsessed with being good enough before you step out into the boat, out of the boat like Peter did, and then you can be used by God, what happens is the enemy has you right where he wants you because he's going, yeah, you'll never get there. But God does not require perfection. He requires a yes. This is such a simple, awesome truth that Peter's beginning to show us. But the question this morning is, what was Peter missing? What was Peter missing? We're going to ask that every week in this series as we look at these characters. What was missing in their lives that they needed so bad? And some of you, as we begin to read Peter's story, you might be thinking, oh, I think I got it already. I think Peter was missing a purpose, right? That's a really cute word right now, purpose. Calling, right? I think that's what Peter was missing. Because he maybe he wasn't fully fulfilled in his job as a fisherman. That wasn't, exactly what he wanted. But once he meets Jesus, he's going to go all in. So I think maybe that's what he was missing. I don't think so. I think there's a lot more to Peter's story here. So let's keep going. I told you it's a lot. Stick with me. We're going to jump a gap, all right? Peter and the disciples have been following Jesus for about 3 years now. And throughout the entire time that they're following him, he's kind of hinting at this idea of, hey guys, I'm going to be killed. Because I'm just going to be honest with you. There's going to come a time when I'm not with you anymore. And he keeps telling them that, the prophecies about how, the Messiah is going to die, and he's kind of telling them these things, and they're like, no, there's no way. He's like, no, I'm being really honest. This is what's going to happen. They're like, no, there's no way. You kind of see this pattern all over their time with him. But now, what we're going to pick up on is the last night with Jesus. We have this beautiful picture of the Last Supper. Jesus is sitting at his table with his closest followers, some of his best friends. And Jesus is telling him, hey, take this bread. This is my body that's going to be beaten for you. And they're still like, I don't really get what's happening because you're still here right in front of us. We would never let this happen. And then he turns to Judas and he says, hey, you're going to be the one that actually betrays me. How this is going to play out is actually through you. In the middle of this heated moment, I would imagine that the rest of the disciples are looking down, kind of like in small group when somebody asks if anybody wants to pray. You know what I'm saying? And so a lot of the other disciples are trying to sneak out of the room, right? But Peter's not like that. What Peter does is he's like, no, I'll talk. I love talking. I love the sound of my voice. Check this out. Matthew 26. Peter replied, in the middle of all this Judas stuff, Peter says this. And I like to picture Peter very dramatic, so. Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you. I picture him looking off in the distance. I never will. Wow, great, Peter, thanks. Jesus says, truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. AKA, Peter, shut up, stop talking. But Peter declared, he doubles down, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples said the same. I love that that's included. They're like, yeah, me too. I guess it's fine. If Peter's going to talk, then I'll just say, yeah. Peter is so bold, right? He doubles down. He says, I would die with you, Jesus, before I would ever disown you, before I would ever say I don't know you, before I ever deny you, Lord. I am so on fire for you. I dropped my nets. I used to be a fisherman, but now I am just the best disciple, aren't I? But we know how the story goes. That night, Jesus goes out into the garden, and we find him alone with God, praying over and over again, God, if there's any way to accomplish your mission without me going to the cross, please let me know right now, because I don't want to do this. And he's praying this over and over again, and he's going back to check on his disciples, and they're asleep, and this whole process keeps repeating, and then the guards show up, right? We know how this goes. Judas is there, and he betrays Jesus, and then Peter freaks out and like cuts some guy ears off, and then Jesus like picks it up and like slaps it back on his head or something, I don't know. And then Jesus is taken away. Jesus is arrested. And the darkest day in history begins. And most of the disciples actually go into hiding. Most of the disciples run from this moment, and we don't see them for a couple days. Because they're so scared that if we really, are sold out on this guy and the government is clearly stepping in and arresting him, we're next. And so most of them are nowhere to be seen. But then in Luke chapter 22, it tells us this. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. Yet again, I like sassy Peter. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. "There's one." But the story goes on. Then he went out into the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath. "I don't know the man." Same Peter that dropped his nets, went all in, walked on water, and said, "Jesus, you're the Lord of my life," is now the Peter who is lying in the face of all these people saying, "I don't even know him." But there's one more. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. This next verse is like intimidating if you picture this. I always like to remind us this is a real story in a real place with real people. All right? The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." This is one of the saddest verses. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Jesus knew what he was talking about. And this bold, sold-out Peter goes from being in the inner circle of Jesus' disciples to now going outside and weeping bitterly because he's overwhelmed by the guilt and the shame of the fact that he let Jesus down. So the first chapter was Peter the fisher of men, but the new title that we can give him is Peter the liar. This is Peter the liar. This is a huge plot twist. Right? I mean, how did we get here? Clearly, Peter is still missing something in his life. Clearly, the purpose and the calling is not what he was missing because he had that, and he was still willing to give it all up. So he's missing something else. And what does he do next? John 21 tells us this. "I'm going out to fish." Simon Peter told the rest of the disciples, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. I don't believe in coincidence. Isn't it funny that they're exactly where Jesus found them 3 years ago? They're in a boat, doing what's comfortable, and not very good at it. Full circle moment, isn't it? This guy named Peter, who was on fire for God, within one night goes from that to picking his nets back up and going back to what he's always known. Going back to what's expected of him. Going back to what's comfortable. And I think Peter is a lot like us in this situation, maybe more than we realize. I hope at some point in your life, you've had a personal moment with Jesus. I hope so. I hope at some moment, at some time, you've had a moment where you said, "You know what, I need Jesus. Jesus died on the cross for me. I accept him into my life. I want to live for him." I hope you've had that moment. But my fear is that if you've had that moment, At some point, you've gone from dropping everything, going all in. I'm going to live for God no matter what it looks like, no matter what it sounds like, no matter who says what, I'm all in. And at some point, you picked your nets back up and you were like, well, I'll go to church on Sunday. I think I'm good with my comfortable life, so I'll just go back to that. I think Peter's a lot like us. But before we get into what he was missing, because we're getting there, trust me, stick with me. Before we get there, don't you think it's interesting that Jesus told Peter before he disappointed him that he was going to disappoint him? It wasn't like after this happened, Jesus was like, dude, I never would have thought that you would have done that. Or it was like, you know what? Told you, buddy. Jesus tells him before it even happens, hey, you're going to deny me 3 times. Why does that matter? Well, another thing that we can see from Peter's story is that God expects imperfections. God expects it. God works it into his plan. God calculates the fact that he's working with broken people. And God says, guess what? I can still use it. He expects it. Jesus told Peter before it happened that it was going to happen. Hey, Peter, you're going to disappoint me. And it's not going to stop what I want to do. And that's the same God we're talking about this morning. That's the same God that is living in your life if you've accepted Jesus. Same God is saying, hey, I know you're imperfect. I can work with it because I'm perfect. This is our last section of Peter's story that we're going to read. John 21. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Same exact story as when he found them. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it's the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. All the other disciples begin to row this heavy boat full of fish, and Peter just dives in and swims there. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. So they show up, and Jesus is just like cooking up breakfast. He's like, oh, hey, what's up? He performs the same miracle as he did the beginning of calling his disciples, and this was actually confirmation. This is when the moment when all of them realized that he was actually back from the dead. Oh, we've seen him do this in the past. He just did it again, so we know this is actually Jesus. And then he kind of cooks breakfast, and they're kind of talking to him, and listen to this conversation we have between him and Peter. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Why was this Jesus' focus here at breakfast? Jesus could have talked about anything sitting here. And Jesus is just grilling Peter with the same question. Why? I left something out about Peter's life. See, this call to feed his sheep is all over Peter and Jesus' relationship. This wasn't some new thing that Jesus was like, hey man, I have a new idea of maybe something we could do with you. Throughout Peter's entire life and entire time with Jesus, we see Jesus saying this. Check this out. Matthew 16, 17, and 18. This is right after Peter declares that Jesus is the Lord of his life. Check this out. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. AKA, feed my sheep. And not only that, but in John 1:42, when Jesus first meets Peter, check this out. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John, but you will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter, which means rock. From the beginning of their relationship, Jesus has been telling Peter, hey, you're going to be the rock that I'm going to build my church on. You're going to be the rock that I'm going to use to do big things for the kingdom of God. And now, after the denial, after the cross, after the guilt, after the shame, after all these moments that would have, in our eyes, counted Peter out of the game, Jesus is bringing back up, hey man, my calling on your life has never changed. My ask of you has never changed. The last chapter of Peter's life, if we're going to title it something, is Peter the Rock. Not Dwayne the Rock Johnson, Peter the Rock. He goes through all of these things, the disappointment, everything, the denial, the letting Jesus down, all of this, so that God could actually develop Peter the Rock. If you think that we've skipped over a lot of stories so far, you wouldn't even believe how much is on the other side of this conversation at breakfast. There's this amazing moment where Jesus ascends into heaven, and there's a day called Pentecost where the Holy Spirit comes down and over 3,000 people are baptized in the name of God, and the church really begins in that moment, and you will never guess who the keynote speaker was. Peter. Peter the liar, the same guy who denied Jesus, that same Peter. So what was he missing? How did he do all this? What changed at breakfast to allow him to actually go on to do what God wanted to do through him? I believe Peter was missing his identity. I believe the entire story of Peter can be summed up as a journey towards identity. Right? He's a fisherman by trade. So he's like, this is what I do, this is who I am, and I just hope I can make some money and live a good life. And then he meets Jesus. And he's like, oh, forget that. I'm going to go all in on Jesus because this has to be who I am now and what I'm all about. But then the moment he lets Jesus down and things aren't picture perfect, he's like, no, actually, I'm kind of out on that. I don't really belong to that group anymore. And then Jesus reminds him over breakfast, hey, who are you? Oh, yeah, you're the rock. Who are you? Oh, yeah, feed my sheep. He reminds him who he is in Jesus. And then Peter goes on to do incredible things. Peter starts churches. Peter writes letters into the New Testament. Peter is actually crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified the same way that Jesus was. The same Peter who denied that he even knew Jesus. And what changed was he realized whose he was. What changed is he said, I'm no longer walking in my own strength. I'm no longer basing this on what I can do or what I can produce or what my job is or anything like that. I'm basing my entire life on who Jesus is and who he said that I am. I believe some of us in the room are missing our identity. I think some of us in the room, we actually don't know where we get our sense of worth and value and identity from. And an indicator of this is every group that you belong to. You've got maybe job over here, you've got school over here, you've got church over here, you've got family over here, and all those different groups you belong to, guess what? You have to play a part everywhere you go. When I'm with my family, I want to talk this way, I want to act this way, I want to cuss this way, I want to make these jokes, I want to make them really like me. When I'm at work, I'm talking about whatever they're talking about. I'm going to read whatever they're reading, I'm going to watch whatever they're reading because I got to play the part at work that I'm the cool coworker. When I'm at church, I got to be all cleaned up. I might even show up 5 minutes early because I really, really want to be a church person. And you begin to play all these roles that you think these people want you to play because your identity is actually based on them and not on the God who died for you. I think that's where some of us are. I really, really do. What's missing for you might be that you don't know who you are. Because what's crazy is when Jesus dying on the cross for you actually becomes the most important thing, everything else gets a little bit quieter. It doesn't matter what you look like, what you sound like, where you go, who you talk to. It doesn't matter because your identity, who you are as a person, is based on the blood of Jesus. I wasn't sure if I was going to share this first service, but yet again, I feel like somebody needs to hear this. In the bottom of my notes, the last thing I wrote is share the thing, ? So I'm going to share the thing this morning. Here's the deal. Nobody else in this room before this morning Nobody knows this besides my wife, really. But I hear all the time, oh man, it must be so easy for you to get up and to preach and to teach and to talk to people and all those different types of things. It must just be so easy for you. You're so natural, and it just must make sense, right? Every single time I preach, I break out in a rash right here. Usually goes up my neck. If it's really bad, it's in my face. Every time I preach, I don't eat before. Every time I preach, especially on a Sunday morning, I usually don't sleep the night before very much. Every single time. And when I first got into ministry, I was told, hey, it'll get better. Repetition, repetition, repetition. It'll get better. It hasn't gotten better. And every time I leave a stage, the enemy attacks me harder than he's ever attacked me. Every single time. And some of you are like, you should just change jobs, bro. Like, you should just, I don't know why you're still doing this. But for me, this is confirmation that my identity is in Jesus. My entire identity and who I am as a person is in Jesus because I believe so much that he calls the shots that I'm willing to go wherever he wants me to go. And I completely am so uncomfortable and outside of myself every time I'm in these settings, and yet I know that I'm stepping outside of the boat like Peter did, and I'm walking in what Jesus has called me to do. And the reason why I wanted to share that this morning is because I don't know if you're sitting here and you're like, man, it must be so easy to just stand up there and be the, believe in God because you're paid to do it, right? It must just be so easy to live so boldly for God and all those things. Can I be honest with you? It's not. But it is confirmation that I am so sold out for Jesus and my identity is rooted in him that it doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter if I never get to do this again. I believe so securely in the fact that Jesus died for me, and that's more than enough. I don't know where you are this morning. I don't know what life looks like outside of this building. I don't know all of your stories and all of the nuances of your life. I don't know. But I don't need to know. Because I know that Jesus died in your place too. I know that Jesus bought you with a very high price when he shed blood in your place. And I cannot imagine what it would look like if we began to live our lives like that was true. I cannot imagine what it would look like if we found the missing piece of our lives and said, you know what, I belong to Jesus and that's enough. Whatever he asked me to do, wherever he asked me to go, whatever he asked me to say, whoever he asked me to talk to, I'm so good with it. Because I deserve the opposite of what I've been given through Jesus. Would you pray with me this morning? Father, we just come before you today and we thank you for the opportunity to be in a place like this where we get to worship you. We get to open your word. We get to learn truth about who you are and stand confidently on that. Lord, I pray for anybody in this room today that maybe is beginning to see that the missing piece in their own life is identity. They follow Jesus passionately for a week or for a couple weeks or whenever something is awesome is happening in their lives, but then a lot of the other times, they're not too sure. Lord, I pray for anybody in the room right now that's struggling in that way. I pray that we begin to have some kind of consistency in you. A mature believer is consistent. Lord, I pray we begin to understand that you died in our place, and so therefore you call all the shots on who we are, what we should say, and what we should do. I pray this morning that we can begin to step out of the boat a little bit. We're not just seeking what's comfortable, what feels good, what sounds good, what looks good, but we begin to seek you above all else. We begin to buy into the fact that you are the ultimate source of our identity, and if that's true, everything is going to change. Lord, this morning we worship you, we praise you, we thank you for the fact that you died in our place. Amen.